Welcome, Exile. With every new league, we are given a new way to die in Path of Exile. For Heist League, it's all about those sweet shotgun door camping brigade parties that will grant you a one-way ticket to the afterlife, which would bring your sweet dreams of carrying that beautiful Exalt back to the bank crashing down. Fear not, my friend, for I have the build for you. Righteous Fire Flame Wall Chieftain, aka the Tank. This build was funded on a shoestring budget so as to remain as affordable as possible. The character focused on life and defenses while still having enough damage to take down the endgame content in respectable fashion. Now, the build's main focus was tankiness and survivability because I wanted it to be a tool for players to take down hard endgame bosses, helping one survive the harsh learning curve of instant death many of these bosses deal out by giving you a way to survive that. To that end, I focused on budget gear as well as tanky passive choices. Although this is how I built the character, I will be giving some alternative suggestions for those of you who would rather forgo some of the girth and thickness for that sweet, sweet damage. Let's jump right into the gear. So when I'm going over gear here, I'm going to specifically try to mention alternatives or early leveling pieces and then escalate into the gear I have now. And then also I'm going to mention gear upgrades you can make from what I have here. Because the reality is the gear I have on right now, it's budget. I bought a lot of these things for, I'm pretty sure I bought this belt for a couple C. I'm pretty sure I bought these boots for a couple C. I bought this shield for 5C. I bought the rings and scepter around 5 to 10C with the fractures on it, and then I threw a couple of essences at it and a couple scorched fossils at it. The reality is, a lot of this gear is cheap. The Replica Atziri I brought for 25C. Kaoms art, probably one of my most expensive pieces, was 8 cards, and I bought them for like 7C a piece, 8C a piece. It was around 50 to 60 casts. I don't know if Kaoms art's going to go up. I usually think Kaoms art typically goes cheaper during the league, so I think it's going to be even more cost efficient for you when you go to buy it in the league. But anyways, point is, the gear's pretty cheap. There will be upgrades from what I have here, and I'm going to try to go over them. So to start things off, we'll start with the shield slot. Early on, you're going to use something like a Spring Leaf. This gives you just 3% regen. It's just a real nice early regen shield. Eventually, when you get to level 40, which will be shortly after you transition to RF, you can switch into the Oak. It's a faded version of this, which basically has up to 150 flat life. So it's the same thing where it gives you 3% regen, but then it gives you 150 flat life. This thing's cheap. Just buy the Prophecy or buy the Oak itself. And you can use this pretty much. I used it all the way up until I was like level 90 or something. I switched into Saffels really late. I was kind of being lazy about it. Didn't want to go take the time to trade somebody. But inevitably, Saffels will be more one-shot protection. Even though it doesn't give us life, it gives 4 max all res, which is huge. You got to picture it as if you're taking, for the example of being 76 cold res, 76 lightning res, it roughly translates to 20% less lightning or 20% less cold damage taken, which is a huge damage mitigation against a lot of damage in the game. So it's really good for tankiness, as well as plus 4 max to fire res, which is great for us to sustain Righteous Fire and not degen. Next up for the ring slots, early on I'd recommend going with Pyre rings. You can also do Kikazarus rings if you're starting, like if you're trying to start Righteous Fire at level 16, you probably want to go with Kikazarus for the early regen. But eventually I like to start out with Pyres just because they give a lot of burning damage. Keep in mind, if you have flat cold dispels anywhere, that will be converted by the Pyre rings into fire damage and it'll brick your EE. So you got to be careful about having flat fire dispels on like your Sceptre or something while you have these rings because it will brick EE. So just be careful of that. Really, just when it comes to EE, just highlight over your tooltip on Orb of Storms when you're in a map. And if it says just lightning or just cold and it doesn't say fire, you're fine. If it says flat fire, you got to figure out where that is on your gear and make sure to get rid of it because it's breaking your build. Next up after rings, besides doing the leveling rings of Pyre stuff, you want to go for a ring that's like a coral ring, an amethyst ring, or the best in slot I would say is probably a vermilion ring or a opal ring if you want to go for damage. Vermilion if you want to be a little bit more tanky, opal ring if you want to go for more damage. And then I would try to get a fracture of flat life, high flat strength, or flat chaos res. From this point of the ring, you can then craft a pretty good ring on top of it by spamming shrieking essences of anger or deafening essences of anger if you have more currency, to the point where you at least hit like a decent res or a decent life. You'll see I had chaos res on this one and I hit a flat life and flat lightning res roll, so I kept it. I hit flat life, or no, on this one I hit flat lightning resistances and open prefix, so I crafted damage. So this is kind of what my rings looked like. These are kind of just cheap rings I bought and threw a couple essences at, nothing real special there. But that's the process of upgrading. In the process of changing out my double pyres, I went from I think I went from about 7,000 life to about 8,000 life, so the difference you make in getting 200 flat life on your rings is pretty big, especially it could be even bigger if you have like Vermilion rings going on. That being said, though, I think I also upgraded my Atziri's Foible when I did that, which was like a 50 flat life upgrade there on my Foible as well, so we got a considerable amount of life just from upgrading our jewelry. And originally on this jewelry slot, I had a Shaper's Seed. If you can swap to Atziri's Foible early on, it is amazing for Righteous Fire level. The life recovery rate gives you a whole bunch of sustain. The flat life is just nice for getting a high flat life pool. This isn't your best in slot. Later in the late game, if you get a lot of currency, you get Awakener Orb. I'd recommend going for Awakening Orb, an Intelligence Gem, plus a Fire Gem from a Warlord, an Intelligence Gem from a Hunter Amulet. Awakening Orb that together to get a +2 amulet. And then ideally, you could either craft flat life on, or you hit flat life on the Awakening Orb if you're really lucky. And then maybe getting some fire damage on the Suffix or fire dot multi on the Suffix. Stuff like that would be really, really high end. Just kind of lucky if you hit that stuff. Ideally, though, a +2 amulet is going to be better than this, especially for damage, considering how much single target Flame Wall gets with levels. Looking at the belt slot, this is pretty much just a random belt I bought off trade for like 5C or so. God, it has resistance, has life. This is not going to be your best in slot. Your best in slot is going to be something like a leather belt. I'd recommend Elder level, at least level 75, that can get you the top roll for life recovery rate and percent max life. The belt bases are usually pretty cheap. You probably can afford to get item level 81 or 84 for either tier 1 chaos res or tier 1 elemental resistances. And then you want to spam these with pristine fossils plus frigid if you're going for cold resistance, plus aberrant if you're going for chaos resistance, or just straight up pristines if you're doing all right on those resistances already on your other pieces of gear. Because the ideal belt here is going to be life recovery rate, percent life, and flat life. This is going to be huge for your life pool. Frankly, if we had percent life on our belt, we would be somewhere closer to 9,700, 9,800, 9,600 just from upgrading our belt, getting and then having it qualitied. And you want the belt to be normal when you quality it with fertile catalysts, so that way it only takes 4 fertile catalysts to get to the maximum quality. Looking at a pair of boots here, this is really about capping some resistances. At the time, I needed some cold res, I needed some chaos res, so I just searched the trade site for life, cold res, chaos res, and an open prefix so I could craft movement speed and onslaught. This is a cheap pair of boots, cost me a couple chaos, fixed my issues. If you want to min-max your pair of boots, I'd recommend going for a pair of boots with the increased crit enchant if you want to get more damage in terms of getting higher uptime on your elemental overload, or go for the percent regen enchant if you just want even more consistent sustain than you already have. On top of that, you could go for a modifier for like fizz reduction with Warlords mods. You get regen with Warlords mod. There's a couple other ones like you max fire res you can get with Crusader mods. So your options are pretty wide in terms of the boot slot. If you want to look for min-max perfect gear or what would be min-max gear, you can look at the Harvest video, but it's going to be hard to get that gear in this current league with how expensive it would be, but you can shoot for definitely better gear than what I have here. Now looking at our glove slot, really what we cared about was getting a pseudo 5-link, so we crafted this with Essences of Delirium. You just grab a pair of gloves. I'd recommend doing a Hunter pair of gloves just for the off chance you hit Fire Dot Multi on the Suffix with Essence of Delirium. It would make for a really cool pair of gloves. So that's what we did. We didn't hit Essence of Delirium and Fire Dot Multi, but we hit OK Cold Res and some Hybrid Life and we called it a day. That was good enough for us. We didn't want to spend a lot of currency just constantly re-rolling this pair of gloves. Ideally, for min-maxing the end game of this build, it would be getting Essence of Delirium, Fire Dot Multi, decent life, and then being able to craft on AoE gems. Even before you can do Essence of Delirium if you can't afford that yet, just get a pair of gloves that get you life and helps cap out your resistances. That's all you really need. After the gloves, we're looking at our Sceptre slot here. What I'd recommend in terms of being able to get the best bang for your buck Sceptre is buying a Sceptre that has a decent fracture mod. I got a tier 3% fire damage. I said that's pretty good, and I threw some Scorch Fossils on it until I hit +1 fire spell, percent fire damage, and then I had a prefix that was filled, and I used a Lucky Annulment Orb. I annulled it off, and I was able to craft percent Fire Dot Multi. Really, this is something like it greatly reduces the amount of cost it is to craft it if you already have a guaranteed force mod on there. So I'll leave in the description a link to a PoE trade search that will specifically be searching for a few different fractured mods. That way you can get some decent options to choose from. Buy one of those, and then I would recommend crafting on that rather than trying to buy a Sceptre already crafted. People are going to charge a ridiculous amount of money because, you know, these are kind of hard to craft. With the fracture mod, they can become a whole lot easier to get a decent one. Honestly, though, while you're leveling, while you're going through up to yellow maps, even up to the early reds, all you really need is just a Sceptre that has like You just get percent fire damage and craft fire dot multi, or get fire dot multi and craft percent fire damage. You don't have to look for anything super special. Just make sure you don't have plus fire spells on it, and you're going to be fine. Now looking at our helmet slot, this is our 6-link setup. This is our pseudo 6-link for Flame Wall. And we crafted Essence of Horror plus burning damage. To do this, you want to get a item level 82 Elder strength-based helmet. The reason for strength-based is you don't want to have a chance at rolling mana, because if you have an int base, you can roll mana. It's a large mod pool. It makes rolling the helmets harder. And on top of that, you don't want evasion-based, because we don't really get dexterity in the build. I have 34 dexterity right now, and an evasion base would require a lot of dex and make it harder for us to equip the helmet. We'd have to get more dex on our gear, stuff like that. Makes it more difficult. So strength-based, I'm level 82, Elder helmet. And then this is really kind of one of the more RNG, heavy currency investment things. Originally, I would say throw an Essence of Horror at it, get a 5-link, be fine with that. That'll take you well into the red maps. Frankly, if I just had the 5-link, I probably could still do Uber Elder. I probably could still do Uber Atziri. It would just take longer. I'd say I'd be doing a 33% less damage, so I would take 50% longer to do the fight, something like that. A fight that would take me 5 minutes now takes me 7.5 minutes. You're still going to be able to do the fight. You still can absorb the damage, but until you have a lot of budget, don't try to go balls to the wall trying to get burning damage until you've made other upgrades in your gear, because the reality is to hit burning damage, it is something like a 1 in 20 on Essence of Horror, so there's not great odds, and it's a 1 in 12 to hit Conk Effect. If you hit Conk Effect, you probably could sell the helmet for a decent amount of money to somebody else playing just Righteous Fire pseudo 6-link. If you hit burning damage, then you're in luck. You're good to go. But this is one of those upgrades where you don't necessarily need it, but it will feel good when you do get it, and don't throw your bank account out the window. First, make upgrades on all your other gear slots. These are much cheaper upgrades. They're much less RNG gated. Burning damage is a little bit more of an RNG fiesta, and it feels a little bit bad. And on top of that, even if you still want 6-link damage, one of the routes you can go is you can drop the Kaoms heart. You'll see we go from about 9.5 to 7.5. You can switch this out for a 6-link Ambus charge. I think they're like 1020C. They're really pretty cheap. That would probably take you close to 7,800. You're still going to have an incredible amount of life where you'll absorb most damage, and you can have an easy 6-link that way, and you can do that until you can have more budget to afford upgrading to a 6-link like this. Last but certainly not least, we have Kaoms Heart. This is the big boy of high HP builds. The reality is, because of this chest piece, we could hit 10k if we really wanted to, pushing a couple more levels, getting a decent Elder belt, getting better life rings like Vermilion rings with good fractures and higher flat life. We could put this well above 10k, and it would feel really cool to get there. The only reason I'm not doing that is because I'm excited to play new builds. I'm thinking about doing a strength stacker tomorrow with the new Alberon's boots. But point is, this chest piece is great if you want to go for a really high life pool and feel really juicy, really tanky. Now, unfortunately, with Kaoms Heart, we lose a lot of sockets. Because we're looking to have 2 damage skills with our Righteous Fire and our Flame Wall, we have about 10 sockets to work with. And with considering movement skills and utility skills we're very limited, and we end up having to drop a Curse, drop Combustion Support, drop another Stormbrand to keep an additional Elemental Overload uptime up. There's some disadvantages to using the Kaoms Heart here, and I know I'm taking those disadvantages. It makes the build more simple, it makes it easier to play, but at the same time, we lose out on something like more single target on big bosses. So with that being said, I'm going to go over some alternatives you guys can use if you want to go for more single target, if you want to dump a little bit of defenses to go into more damage, stuff like that. So to start off with, a great option for you guys is going to be the Searing Touch staff. This staff is really good for Righteous Fire and Flame Wall damage, and frankly, we could do it. If you see this, you're thinking, oh, but if you drop your Saffels Flame, you're not going to be able to sustain your Righteous Fire. Joke's on you, we'll sustain our Righteous Fire just fine. You'll see, we have a Righteous Fire, it's sustaining just fine without the Saffels Flame. We can put it back on, and we're all good. So if we had just a staff, we would still sustain, and you'd have a decent amount of damage. You'd lose some level of defenses to single hits being able to kill you, but at the same time you'd pick up a bunch of damage, and that's an alternate way to play the build and have fun with it. On top of being able to swap out Saffels Frame and this setup for like a Searing Touch for more damage, you could also swap out your Kaoms Heart for something like a Guatzalides life chest piece with percent life crafted on it, and that chest piece would be able to have a decent amount of life while also giving you another 6-link to work with. So you could put your Flame Wall in your chest piece, you could put your Righteous Fire in your 6-link helmet here, and then you could have 4 more links to do things like Stormbrand, to do things like Wave of Conviction supported by Combustion to have more minus fire res on enemies for more single target. there's some additional qualities of life you could get by having those sockets back. So don't feel like the end-all be-all is Kaoms Heart. I love to play with it. It feels good. But there are other options. I hope that gives you a good idea on what gear to go for. Now let's talk about flasks. To start off with flasks, people always ask me about this. Why do you use a small life flask? The reason for me using the small life flask is it costs the least amount of charges. So what that means for me is it's going to take the least amount. Oh, hey, Gray Reaper, if you're watching this, thank you for the follow. I didn't realize I had their alerts on because I'm recording this with Streamlabs OBS. Anyways, the reason for using the small life flask is because it costs the least amount of charges. If we're in a battle, if we're taking a lot of hits, often when we're about to take damage, I like to turn my Righteous Fire off to not only proc our Arakaali Pantheon to get 50% life recovery rate, but also to prepare ourselves to stop taking degen, so that way when we take a hit, we're going to be recovering and we're not going to be losing life from our Righteous Fire and the damage we just took, and we can get back up to full faster. In the fight, I'm going to be doing this on and off a lot, and eventually, I will run out of my life flask here. Now, the advantage of a small life flask is it costs 7 charges. If you get reduced charges used, it goes to 5 charges. I should have taken the time to roll this. I forgot to, but that's what you want to roll it for. You get it at item level 11, so you need an item level like 11 small life flask to get it. Point is, with Ryslatha, our minor Pantheon, you get 3 flasks every 3 seconds, which means if this flask costs us 5 charges, within 6 seconds, we will have enough charges to then turn our Righteous Fire off again. The idea is we want to be able to turn it off as quickly as possible in a very dangerous situation. If we wasted our charges, the Eternal Life Flask would be 15 charges, which would mean we'd be waiting 15 seconds. Now, I'd rather wait 6 seconds to turn off my Righteous Fire faster to get out of a dangerous situation than waiting 15 seconds. For the most part, I'm very consistently having the charge ready to turn off a life flask whenever I get to those dangerous situations. There's kind of intervals based on the boss fights you're doing, and typically the wait time of 5 seconds to get the flask charge back to have the next time you can turn off your Righteous Fire usually is enough to do fights like Uber Atziri, like Uber Elder, and it works well. If I was doing something like an Eternal Life Flask, sure, I would get an extra like 2,000 life regen over the course of the life flask, but the reality is, with Righteous Fire, when you turn it off, you generate to full faster than that flask can go through like 20% of its whole total flask, and the rest of the flask is going to be wasted anyways. So really, you want a small life flask here just so you can manually turn off your Righteous Fire on and off whenever you need to in danger. So that's the reason for the small life flask. The other flasks is more self-explanatory. We got bleed removal and enduring mana flask. This is so that we can sustain our casts of flame wall when I cast it obnoxiously way too many times and stuff like that, because we don't have a lot of mana regen on the tree, so we need a flask to sustain it. Then we have a granite flask. This is great for defensive capabilities. We got remove freeze on it and increased duration. Then we have a sulfur flask. I don't know if this is necessarily the best option. Maybe basalt would be better. I like it okay because it puts down consecrated ground, which gives us 6% regen, which is nice. It's not the greatest AoE, but it still works pretty well, and we have remove curses on it, so that way when we're running through a curse map, we don't really have to deal with curses too much. And then last but not least, as always, Quicksilver with Adrenaline, just for that movement speed and clear speed while mapping. It feels really great, feels really good. I wouldn't go anywhere without it, really. After flasks, we really should talk about gem links. To start it off, Wave of Conviction, Orb of Storms. These are both about taking resistance off enemies. Wave of Conviction inflicts exposure on enemies, which will subtract their resistance by 25, which is huge for damage. You may be thinking this hits the enemy with fire damage, and it does, and that's going to ruin our EEE. But if we have Orb of Storms, this is going to be hitting like every 0.5 seconds, I believe, which will then overwrite the bad EE we inflict with Wave of Conviction. So if we put an Orb of Storms down, we Wave of Convict, that'll hit the enemy, and then the Orb of Storms will overwrite that. Which this means is we'll get minus 50 res from Elemental Overload, or not Elemental Overload, Elemental Equilibrium from Orb of Storms, and minus 25 from Wave of Conviction. These are both very important for single target on bosses. Typically, I never use Wave of Conviction until I am doing a boss fight, and I'll do Orb of Storms for tanky rares in a map. Next, we got Malevolence. This is important for damage. Malevolence gives about 20% more damage at level 20. We could technically go grab a dex node on the tree just so we could level it up to 20, which I think we could do since we have the Atziri's Foible 25% reduced attribute requirement. I personally didn't care to go get a dex node on the tree, and I'm happy with 16% more damage with a lower level Malevolence, because that way I didn't really have to worry about getting dex on my gear or anything like that. Looking at our flame wall, we have it linked to Elemental Focus, controlled destruction, and efficacy. If we didn't have a burning damage support in our helmet, like if you're just on a 5-link, I would have burning damage instead of controlled destruction to start out with. After Flame Wall, we have Righteous Fire. Righteous Fire, of course, is linked to Elemental Focus, burning damage, and then we have it on increased AoE. This is just because it's basically our clear skill for the most part. If you wanted to swap it in for more boss damage, you can use Conk Effect, which would increase your single target with your Righteous Fire. Now, looking at our movement skills, we have Shield Charge, linked to Fortify, linked to faster attacks. This is just so while you're mapping through maps, you pretty much always have Fortify uptime, and it feels good to move around with Shield Charge. I personally like it a lot. Some people don't like it as much, but I like the movement skill of Shield Charge. You can swap this around with other things based on what you find is your personal preference. After that, we have Purity of Fire. This we do not swap into until very late game. Initially, you're going to level with Vitality instead of Purity of Fire. The reason for this is Purity of Fire doesn't get much max res until like level 10 and level like 15 and level 17 and level 20. I don't swap into Purity of Fire until it's at level 20 with +4 max fire res, because Vitality is more sustained than Purity of Fire is until that point. So really, I would use Vitality, level with it, have Purity of Fire in your offhand over here, and have Vitality over here until you get it to level 20, then make the swap then. It's better not single target, it's better at evading or not dying to single one hits when you have Purity of Fire in. But initially with Vitality, with the more sustain, it feels better, especially early leveling and going into early mapping. And then eventually Purity of Fire, I think, outweighs it. After Purity of Fire, we have Immortal Call. Now you may have noticed in those clips, I procced Immortal Call when I knew I was about to take a big slam, like the Meteor Maze or the Meteor Bomb from Awakener, like the Atziri Storm Calls, Flame Blast, Shaper Slam, stuff like that. Immortal Call is one of those things where if you proc it for when you're about to take a big hit, you're going to survive the majority of those big hits. There's a few you won't survive, like the Uber Atziri Uber Flame Blast, but for the most part, pretty much every attack in the game, if you have Immortal Call up, you're going to survive it. Now, after Immortal Call, we have Flame Dash. I think this is very important for movement in maps. Say you run into a ledge with Shield Charge, you can then just Flame Dash over that ledge, keep moving. As well as in boss fights, Flame Dash is an awesome movement skill, and I'd really recommend it. Last but not least, we have Enduring Cry. This is amazing for endurance charge generation. It gives us additional fizz reduction, additional elemental resistances, and it gives us a bunch of regen. It's not really necessary for sustain at this point. It was initially in the build, but at this point, it serves as a safety mechanism against dangerous fights. If we get hit to half health or 10% of our health, and then we have our Enduring Cry come out of nowhere, it's going to take us right back up to full in the matter of a second, and it's very, very nice to have when you just get hit or you just take a big hit from a dangerous situation. So very important for sustain, would not go without it. I believe that wraps up the gem links, the gear we use. Real quickly, I'm going to go over Pantheon. It is Soul of Arakaali, and it is Soul of Ryslatha. Ryslatha is for regenerating our life flask so we can turn our Righteous Fire on and off at will during a boss fight, and Arakaali is so we can get life recovery rate whenever we turn off our Righteous Fire, as well as getting 30% reduced shock effect. This is actually really big because we get shock immunity in this build through the use of 30% reduced shock effect here, and then we get another 50% on these nodes here, and another 20% here. That makes 100% reduce of shock, which means we can't be shocked. It's effectively shock immune, which is a huge defensive mechanic of our build, considering how dangerous shock is. After Pantheons, I should probably mention this, we kill all bandits. We don't save any of them. We kill them all for the 2 passive points. Now, speaking of passive points, let's get into the passive tree. To start off the passive tree, looking at the Ascendancy nodes, we want to go straight up for Cleansing Water to start out with, next to Valakut, then up through the Fire Dot Multi, Sun's Light, and the Cover Enemies in Ash, Death's Fury. These are all great for damage, these are great for sustain, and this one's great for sustain and damage. These are awesome nodes for Righteous Fire. I wouldn't really change these except for the small scenario where you're playing the Auto Bomber Righteous Fire build I made last league. In this league, since you don't have the ability to have insane gear like you could in Harvest, I suspect you might need a little bit more flat damage or fire damage that you hit the enemies with to chain the explosions, and I suspect you might need to go with Namahu's Flame instead of Ramako's Sunlight for converting 50% of the fizz damage of the explosions you do with the Explode mod to fire, so that way instead of 25% fizz as fire, you get 75% fizz as fire, so the base fire you're hitting the enemies with to chain ignites with is way higher. This is one alternate suggestion you might need to do if you're doing the Righteous Fire Auto Bomber, which is a separate build I made last league, and you can check out if you're interested in a much higher damage or clear speed setup. Speaking of damage and clear speed, this build we did not prioritize that. We went with life. I'll keep repeating that. In this scenario that you want to not go for all this life, all this defensive mechanics, I would suggest going for cluster jewels and start dropping nodes where I picked up extra life that I don't necessarily need to. Mainly, I would recommend dropping some additional life nodes we have. We're at 9k, approaching 10k life. You can drop this all the way down to 7k life, even 6k life, and probably still feel pretty strongly defensive and good on the build. It's kind of up to you, but main recommendations would be going for cluster jewels. Cluster jewels are going to be huge for damage. You need the ignite prolif. You need something like brush with death. Flow of life feels great. Another node like burning bright is always good. All over those cluster jewels is a ton of damage for righteous fire, and it's definitely one of the ways you're going to pick up the single target for this. You're going to lose some defensives doing it, but you're going to pick up the single target significantly. I wouldn't recommend it if you're really wanting to do consistent endgame fights until you are more skilled at the fights. So if you're new to doing those fights, I'd recommend sticking with this tanky setup. It'll allow you to absorb really deadly attacks and kind of learn the mechanics of, okay, that hurts a lot, I need to dodge that, stuff like that. If you convert this into the very, very more high-end damage, still pretty tanky version, you probably will die a lot more often in those fights, and it won't be quite as forgiving to learn those fight mechanics. So that's kind of up to you. Transition it at your own risk of dying, but also at your own risk of doing a lot more damage, because this build has a lot to give in terms of damage. With Flame Wall, we're currently around 1,000,000 DPS roughly. That between that and the Righteous Fire, we're doing quite a bit of damage, but we haven't really spec'd for damage at all. We've obviously spec'd a lot for life on the tree. Pretty much vast majority of our tree is centered around life. You can see we picked it up pretty much everywhere we went. So the reality is you can go for more single target, but I'd recommend sticking with this first to learn boss fights if you haven't done like Uber Elder, Uber Atziri, Awakener. If you haven't done those fights yet, I'd keep it in this state to learn the mechanics and then transition it over to more offensive mechanics. So if you want trees based on more offensive mechanics, look at my Righteous Fire Auto Bomber character. That character's set up for damage. This character's set up for life and defenses. That's the kind of two variations of Righteous Fire we have here. Now, when leveling this tree, in the video description, I'll be leaving a path of building to multiple trees that you can switch around to see when do you take this, what levels should you be, what should the tree look like at certain levels. And also you can check out my video where I said league starting with Righteous Fire. I go over how I plan to league start it and how I did it, and I did exactly that, and it worked, and that's what I'd recommend you guys to do. So you can check out that video, or you can just look at the leveling POBs and copy those pretty much verbatim, however you want to do it, guys. But be sure to download the Local Identity Path of Building fork. I should have mentioned this on the last video. I got a lot of questions about it from people that said the POB work or the POB link isn't working. And the reason for that is I'm using Local Identity, which is the community version of Path of Building. Recently, OpenARL, like in the last year or so, the original developer of Path of Building got hired by Grinding Gear Games, and he has less time to update Path of Building on the regular, and a group of community heroes to spend their time regularly updating it now, and that's the Local Identity Path of Building fork. So go ahead and Google that, or I'll put that in the description, so that way you can look up that Path of Building fork, so that way you won't get the error. I'd highly recommend downloading it. It has a lot more useful tools to it, and it's more regularly updated, so check it out, guys. Now, my brain is going in like 20 different directions. I'm not sure how well I explained everything. I tried to go over all the gear, all the gem links, the passive tree. I'm going to try to put everything in the description for you guys. If I didn't make something clear, feel free to stop by my Twitch, ask me about it. I'd be happy to help you guys out however I can. Other than that, I really hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you guys enjoy the build, and I'll see you guys in the next build guide. Have an excellent day, guys. See you later.